Dante, why is it that being lonely causes such an increase in heart disease and stroke and dementia? I mean, addiction, suicidality, depression, and anxiety, those seem, I mean, that makes sense. That's logical. If I'm lonely, then I get depressed. And then if I'm depressed, then I turn to other things to make me feel better. Okay, I get that. But why heart disease? Why stroke? Why diabetes? Why dementia? What is the connection between loneliness and these negative health outcomes?
So that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I'm perfectly equipped to answer all of that. I don't believe that every one of these mechanisms have been, clearly fleshed out.
Right.
But in general, and especially much of the literature kind of highlights different aspects of this, almost contradictory things at times.
Yeah.
So basically, all that's to say, there are thoughts that the chronic stress associated with the state of loneliness is what is driving almost like these pro-inflammatory pathways in the body that are, making someone a little more predisposed to, heart disease, which is generally an inflammatory process and
right.
an inflammatory disease of the vasculature in the body. So that is one of the most glaring, I think, underlying mechanisms. Now, to counteract that, there are just as many papers saying that social isolation alone. So what did we say that was? Social isolation is separate from loneliness.
Okay.
That's just talking about the quantity of your relationships. So if you fall under this threshold and you have less than X amount of friends, less than X amount of jobs and social circumstances,
right,
then you can be considered socially isolated. Those individuals in certain areas of the research have just as high of associations of many of these physical health issues as those who are experiencing the actual subjective loneliness. Okay. So what I'm saying is we can't just tie this back to, loneliness, it's tied to the chronic stress. It's because of how they're feeling. That's the mechanism that's driving heart disease, driving dementia, driving X or Y, so that my point is, even those who are socially isolated, they may not have all the feelings of the person who is by definition lonely.
Right.
They still have many of these same issues. Now, is it
interesting?
So it's just the point is, this is so multifactorial, right? It's, and again, a lot of these statistics are associative by nature. We're not saying that X is causing Y. We're looking at an association. But again, a lot of this body of research is pointing towards, okay, the more lonely you are, the more likely you are to have many of these, glaring chronic diseases. So you can try to center me a little bit. But again, I think my job with all this is just to prove how sometimes non-black and white this is.
Right. And you said that at the beginning. It's very subjective and each person and case, and it's, what would you say, multifactorial? Like there's multiple layers and so many things to this that it's
a subjective experience.
Correct.
But what you were saying, if I understood correctly, is that regardless of your experience, people who are isolated, so even somebody who doesn't feel they need emotional connections, the lighthouse keeper who's totally happy being out on the island alone for 6 months, those people still suffer many of these same physical side effects, physical consequences. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, there's again, and there are a handful of other papers. There's something I would suggest people read. Honestly, it's in the Journal of Aging, and so this looked a little more. I think again, another one of the big things is that we're not just talking about elderly populations. Like we're talking about something that just as frequently affects those 16 to 24.
Right.
It's widespread.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that early on maybe seem to discriminate across age groups, but it doesn't.
It makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that as somebody ages and their friends pass away or move, that they feel isolated. Maybe the kids grow up and move to a different state. They feel more and more isolated. Sure.
Yep.
But anybody at any stage, I loved the one statistic about, I say loved, you know what I mean, about 51% of mothers with young children feel serious loneliness.
Right.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And if I may, just to, I think, crystallize some of what I'm saying here. This was in the Journal of Aging. It essentially served as a review of much of the literature trying to pinpoint mechanisms by which loneliness is causing or being associated with so many issues. So there was one particular study. On the other hand, many investigators have found social isolation itself to be a risk factor for ill health. In a meta-analysis of studies examining the magnitude of effect of social isolation and loneliness on mortality, in which important baseline health variables were controlled in the analysis, Holt, Lundstedt, and colleagues found a 29% increased risk of mortality over time from social isolation, and 29 versus 26% increase in mortality risk from loneliness.
Wow.
So in that example, there was a slight increase in some of these. There was a slight increase in mortality risk in just those that were socially isolated. Now, baked in a lot of this, and what this journal also highlights, is that there are issues in the questionnaires and
certainly
how they figure out these sort of things.
Because it's so subjective.
Right. And it's not a perfect, we're not dealing with maybe a lab value.
Right.
For example.
Yeah.
Not saying that those are even perfect either.
Even though they're saying measurable levels of loneliness and that sort of thing, it's still a subjective measurement.
Yeah, what is the metric?
Right. So the other point here was stress of loneliness would be a driving factor for ill health, yet aloneness seems to be at least as strong, if not a stronger influence on health.
And did I understand correctly? You said 26 and 29% increase of all-cause mortality. That's amazing and terrifying.
Right. So, and these are a little bit cherry picked, I guess in the context of what we're saying, but I think initially when we were going to talk about this conversation, it was very much loneliness is going to be the focus. It makes intuitive sense that those who are feeling lonely, they're going to have some sort of increased underlying chronic stress that's driving all these potentially inflammatory processes. It makes sense. That's why we're dealing with all these issues. I think that's, again, our reductionist way of thinking about these things.
Right.
But I would be remiss not to say, we should not neglect focusing on also social isolation in and of itself. And I know we'll talk about things that we can do for other people and things you can do for yourself. But even though they try to separate these issues, it's very much important to focus on both.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is still social connectedness is what's associated with the more positive benefits that we're looking for.
And that's a good place to go with it. Is we're not trying to just be, negative about this whole thing and just be doom and gloom about it. The point is that being socially connected is really good for us. We're clearly social creatures. We're clearly meant to be living in relationship with each other. And when we do, all of these other things start to fall in line.